Leo Miller was 11 years old when he finally pulled his exhausted body over the railing of the wooden houseboat, a structure that felt like a ghost floating in a forgotten cove of Beaver Lake. His hands were raw, his clothes were soaked, and his heart hammered against his ribs, not just from exertion, but from sheer terror. He pushed open the unlocked door and stepped inside, expecting rot and decay. Instead, he found a world frozen in time, a sanctuary preserved under a thin veil of dust. Children's books sat neatly on a small table, toy cars were arranged in a perfect line on a shelf, and on the wall hung a photograph of a smiling family on a boat. It was the sight of that impossible love, that captured happiness, that finally broke him. The strength that had fueled his desperate escape vanished, his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the wooden floor, consumed by a wave of uncontrollable sobs that echoed in the silent, floating home. It's a powerful image. A boy finding a refuge only to be overwhelmed by the emotion of it all. If this story is already starting to resonate with you, I'd love to know where you're listening from, so please take a moment to leave a comment down below. It means the world to know where these stories travel, and if you want to follow Leo's journey to the very end, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single part of what happens next. Your support allows these narratives to continue being told, and I am deeply grateful for every one of you who chooses to listen. Now let's get back to the heart of this incredible story and discover what led to this moment. To understand why that floating house, hidden deep in the Arkansas Ozarks, became the catalyst for such a profound emotional release, we must go back in time. We need to travel back 3 days to the cold, sterile hallways of the St. Teresa's Home for Children, a place where hope was a scarce commodity and survival was a daily struggle. It was there, within those oppressive walls, that Leo discovered a horrifying truth that would force him to run for his life. To comprehend the tears of relief he shed on that houseboat floor, we must first witness the quiet terror that defined his existence, a life that was about to be sold for $2,000. Leo Miller was a boy built of silence and observation. At 11 years old, he had learned that survival in a place like St. Teresa's Home for Children was less about strength and more about becoming invisible. For 4 years, ever since the catastrophic dam collapse had stolen his parents and submerged his entire world, this institution had been his reality. The memory of his former life was a flickering candle flame he protected in his mind, a warm, distant light of laughter and safety that stood in stark contrast to the cold drafts that snaked through the dormitory at night. He rarely spoke of his parents, not because he was forgetting them, but because their memory was the only thing that truly belonged to him, a sacred treasure in a life where he owned nothing, not even his own future. He was a quiet watcher, his eyes cataloguing every detail, every shift in mood, every unspoken threat that hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. The home itself was an imposing stone structure, perched on a hill, its windows like vacant eyes gazing down at the sprawling waters of Beaver Lake. It was a place that seemed to absorb sound, where laughter died quickly and footsteps echoed with a lonely, hollow rhythm. The air inside carried a permanent, sterile scent of industrial bleach and boiled cabbage, a smell that clung to the children's clothes and hair, marking them as residents of this joyless place. The walls were painted a pale, sickly green, a color that seemed to drain the warmth from the room, and the floors were always cold, even in the heart of an Arkansas summer. For Leo, the building wasn't a home. It was a fortress designed to keep the world out and to keep the children in, trapped in a cycle of monotonous despair that repeated itself with the rising and setting of the sun. It was a machine for erasing childhood. Every day was an exact replica of the one before, a ritual of survival measured out in meager portions. The single meal of the day was the central event, a testament to their collective privation. The children would line up silently, 58 of them, their faces etched with a practiced neutrality that hid the gnawing hunger in their stomachs. They would be served a ladleful of watery oatmeal from a large metal pot, its consistency thin and grey, accompanied by 2 stale crackers that tasted of cardboard and thyme. They ate quickly without a word, the only sounds being the scraping of spoons against ceramic bowls. This meal was not for nourishment, it was for maintenance. It was just enough to keep them alive, to keep them compliant. to remind them of their absolute dependence on the very system that was slowly starving them of both food and hope. The architect of this bleak existence was the director, Mrs. Marla Peterson. She was a woman who moved through the hallways with a severe, almost silent grace, her presence announced only by the faint jingle of the keys clipped to her belt. She rarely raised her voice, for she didn't need to. Her authority was absolute, woven into the very fabric of the institution. A single cold glance from her was enough to quell any whisper of rebellion, to extinguish any spark of defiance in a child's eyes. She was a constant oppressive weight, a figure of ultimate power who held their miserable lives in her hands. The children learned to anticipate her movements, to feel her approach before they could see her, their bodies tensing with a primal instinct for self-preservation. She was the warden of their prison, and her control was as inescapable as the stone walls around them. Enforcing Mrs. Peterson's rigid discipline was a rotating cast of caregivers, men and women with tired, indifferent faces, who carried out their duties with a chilling detachment. They were the ones who patrolled the dormitories at night and supervised the single daily meal, their eyes scanning for any infraction. The primary tool of their authority was a thin, flexible cane that was often left leaning against a wall in the dining hall, a silent but potent symbol of the consequences of disobedience. The threat of it was more powerful than its actual use. The children knew that any act of defiance, from speaking out of turn to not finishing their meager portion of oatmeal, could result in a swift, stinging punishment that left red welts on their skin and a deeper, invisible scar on their spirit. This constant, low-level terror was the glue that held the fragile order of St. Teresa's together. In this environment of fear and forced silence, the children had developed their own set of unspoken rules. You learned to communicate with subtle glances and nearly imperceptible nods. You learned to make yourself small, to occupy as little space as possible, to draw no attention. Crying was a luxury that could only be afforded at night, muffled into a thin, lumpy pillow so that no one would hear. Leo had mastered this art of invisibility. He moved through his days like a ghost, his expressions neutral, his actions compliant. He understood that to be noticed was to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable was to invite pain. This carefully constructed shield of anonymity had protected him for 4 long years, allowing him to endure the daily grind of hunger, cold, and quiet desperation without breaking. It was a lonely existence, but it was the only one he knew. But in the last 5 months something had changed. The oppressive normalcy of their lives had been punctured by a new and terrifying mystery. It began with Daniel, a boy with a quick smile who was Leo's closest friend. One morning his bed was empty, his few belongings gone. Mrs. Peterson had gathered the children and announced with a rare, thin smile that Daniel had been chosen for a special overseas sponsorship program, a chance at a wonderful new life with a wealthy family in Europe. The story sounded like a fairy tale, a dream come true, but something about her explanation felt hollow. There was no goodbye, no letter, no forwarding address. Daniel had simply vanished, leaving behind a void that the other children felt but did not dare to speak of. 2 weeks later, it was Hannah who disappeared. Then, a month after that, John. The same official story was repeated each time, the details slightly altered, but the core message the same: a miraculous escape to a better life. With each disappearance, however, the fairy tale wore thinner, and the unspoken dread in the dormitory grew thicker. The empty beds were stark, physical reminders of their missing friends. The nights became heavier, the silence filled not just with their own quiet fears, but with the loud, echoing absence of those who were gone. The children stopped looking at each other's faces and started looking at the empty spaces, wondering who would be next to fill one. The sponsorship program was no longer a story of hope. It was a chilling omen. The most recent disappearances had been the most alarming. Laura and Matthew, a brother and sister who were inseparable, vanished on the same day just 3 weeks ago. This time, Leo had seen something. From the dining hall window, he had watched them being led down the long gravel driveway by one of the caregivers. They were not smiling or waving goodbye. Their shoulders were slumped, and they walked with a slow, reluctant gait. A sleek black car with tinted windows was waiting for them at the main gate, an unfamiliar and menacing sight. They were put inside without a word, and the car sped away, leaving behind only a cloud of dust. In that moment, Leo knew with a cold, sickening certainty that his friends were not on their way to a new family. They were being taken somewhere else entirely. That image of the black car became seared into Leo's mind, fueling a growing suspicion that was rapidly hardening into a terrifying conviction. The unspoken dread that had permeated the home had now found a home inside him, a constant, cold knot in his stomach. He began to watch everything more closely, his survival instincts now honed to a razor's edge. He started tracking the caregivers' routines, noting their hushed, brief conversations in the hallways and paying special attention to Mrs. Peterson's schedule. He was no longer just a passive survivor, he was an investigator, piecing together a puzzle without knowing what the final picture would look like. He only knew that the pieces he held were dark and jagged, and that his own life might depend on solving it. The atmosphere among the remaining 53 children had shifted from one of quiet despair to one of active, palpable fear. The younger ones would cry silently in their beds, while the older ones, like Leo, grew even more withdrawn, their faces becoming hard, guarded masks. The name of the overseas sponsorship program was now a curse, a whispered euphemism for an unknown but terrible fate. The illusion of safety, however thin it had been, was completely shattered. Now every time Mrs. Peterson walked down the hall, every time a caregiver's keys jingled, every child would freeze, wondering if their name was the next one on the list. They were no longer just orphans. They were prey waiting for the predator to choose its next target from the flock. It was on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before Leo would find himself on the houseboat, that the oppressive tension was finally set to break. He was assigned his usual chore of cleaning the dining hall after the morning meal, a monotonous task that he normally performed on autopilot. He swept the cold floors, wiped down the long wooden tables, and collected the empty bowls. The room was quiet, empty except for him. It was then, as he was wiping down a table near the caregiver's break room, that he saw it. A cell phone left carelessly on the edge of the table, its screen still illuminated. For a moment he hesitated, the ingrained fear of breaking the rules screaming at him to ignore it, but a stronger, more desperate instinct took over, a need to know the truth. This was the moment everything would change. His hand, slick with the cold sweat of fear, trembled as he reached for the device. Every instinct honed over 4 years of institutional life screamed at him to leave it, to walk away, to retreat back into the safety of invisibility. Touching a caregiver's personal property was a severe infraction, one that would guarantee a painful encounter with the thin cane. Yet, the mystery of the empty beds and the haunting image of the black car were a far more powerful force than his fear of punishment. The phone's screen glowed with an almost malevolent promise of answers, a portal to a truth he felt he had to know no matter the cost. He picked it up, its smooth, cool surface feeling alien in his palm. In that moment, as he shielded the screen with his body, he crossed an invisible line. He was no longer a passive victim of his circumstances. He was actively seeking the nature of the monster that lived in the walls around him. With his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, he began to read. The screen displayed a messaging application, a long thread of conversation between the caregiver and a contact simply labeled Director P. He recognized the cold, transactional language immediately, though the context was horrifyingly unclear at first. There were words like assets, shipment, and unit viability, phrases that belonged in a warehouse inventory, not a discussion about children. He scrolled upwards, his eyes flying across the text, the fragments of information slowly coalescing into a dreadful picture. The messages were a ledger, a cold accounting of human lives. He saw dates, times, and locations, all discussed with a chilling detachment that made the sterile scent of the dining hall feel suddenly suffocating, like the air was being squeezed from his lungs. Then he saw the names: Daniel, Hannah, John. Next to each name was a number, a price: $1,500, $1,700, $2,000. The numbers swam before his eyes, blurring for a second as the full, monstrous implication crashed down on him. This was not a sponsorship program. It was a catalogue, His friends had not been sent to loving families in Europe. They had been sold. The fairy tale Mrs. Peterson had so carefully constructed shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces, revealing the grotesque reality beneath. They were merchandise, their value calculated and negotiated by the very woman entrusted with their care. The watery oatmeal, the thin blankets, the constant hunger, it wasn't just neglect. It was a business strategy, keeping the assets compliant and minimizing overhead before a sale. He kept scrolling, his fingers now numb, moving on pure, horrified momentum. The messages became more explicit, detailing the fates of the children who had been sold. He read about forced begging operations in large cities where children were intentionally maimed to elicit more sympathy and generate higher profits. He saw descriptions of remote, isolated labor camps hidden deep in the state, places where older boys were sent to work until they collapsed from exhaustion, their spirits broken under the weight of endless, brutal toil. The abstract dread he had felt for months was now being filled in with specific, unimaginable horrors. Each word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of his innocence, sealing away any hope that his friends had found a better life. The world he knew was a lie, and the truth was a nightmare. As if that wasn't enough, he stumbled upon a separate, more heavily encrypted thread, discussing what were termed special orders. The language was more vague, filled with euphemisms like biological matching and urgent clinic requests. But the meaning was unmistakable even to an 11-year-old boy: organ trafficking. The thought was so vile, so far beyond the realm of human evil he could comprehend, that it made him physically ill. He leaned against the table, a wave of nausea washing over him as he pictured Laura and Matthew, the inseparable siblings, being taken not for their labor, but for their very parts, their bodies disassembled to fulfill a clandestine order. The black car he had seen was not a transport to a new home. It was a delivery vehicle for a butcher. The scope of Mrs. Peterson's depravity was bottomless. His eyes, wide with terror, scanned a document attached to one of the messages. It was a simple list, a schedule of upcoming deliveries. And there, halfway down the page, typed in the same cold, impersonal font as the others, was his own name: Leo Miller. The letters seemed to leap off the screen, branding themselves onto his mind. The horror was no longer about his lost friends or the other children. It was about him. It was immediate, personal, and absolute. He was not just a witness to this monstrous operation, he was its next scheduled victim. The invisible, anonymous boy who had tried so hard to stay out of sight had been noticed, catalogued, priced, and placed on the shipping manifest. His turn had come. Next to his name was a short, chillingly precise note: Friday, 3 p.m., delivery at the dock. He glanced at the date at the top of the phone's screen. Tuesday. Friday was just 3 days away. 72 hours. The specificity of the instruction left no room for doubt or hope. This was not a vague threat. It was a confirmed transaction, a scheduled appointment with an unspeakable fate. A mental clock began ticking in his head, each second a loud, echoing beat, counting down the final hours of his life as he knew it. 3 days. Then he would be led down the same gravel driveway, placed in the same black car, and delivered to the dock on Beaver Lake to become another ghost. Another forgotten name on a list. In that terrible, clarifying moment, he understood everything. The empty beds, the fake smiles from Mrs. Peterson, the cold indifference of the caregivers, it all snapped into a perfect, horrifying picture. He saw with absolute certainty that there was no one he could turn to for help. The entire system was corrupt. The very people who were supposed to be his guardians were his captors and his brokers. To cry out, to reveal what he knew, would be suicide. It would only alert them that their asset was aware of the transaction, and they would likely expedite his delivery or silence him permanently. He was trapped inside the monster's den, and the monster knew his name. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone in his knowledge and his fear. He gently placed the phone back on the table, wiping it clean with the hem of his shirt. His movements now precise and deliberate, devoid of the earlier trembling. The raw panic was crystallizing into something harder, colder, a singular, desperate resolve. The life of quiet endurance he had so carefully cultivated was over. Staying at St. Teresa's was no longer a strategy for survival. It was a death sentence with a confirmed date. The world beyond the institution's walls, a place he had never known and deeply feared, was now his only hope. His choice had been made for him. He would not be at the dock on Friday at 3 o'clock. He would run. The only question left was how. From that moment forward, Leo existed in two separate worlds. On the outside, he was the same quiet, compliant boy, sweeping floors and wiping tables with a practiced, numb efficiency. But inside, his mind was a whirlwind of frantic calculation, a war room where every detail of St. Teresa's home for children was being weaponized for his survival. The 72 hours he had left were not a sentence, but a deadline. The fear that had initially paralyzed him now sharpened his senses, transforming the oppressive institution from a cage into a complex puzzle he had to solve. He no longer saw walls, he saw obstacles. He no longer heard the caregiver's footsteps. He heard patrol patterns. Every tick of the old clock in the dining hall was a countdown, a beat in the relentless drum of his impending doom, and with each passing hour his resolve hardened from a desperate hope into a cold, unbreakable certainty. He would not be delivered to the dock. He would live. For the next 2 days, he became a shadow with a purpose. He moved through his chores with his head down but his eyes up, absorbing everything. He committed to memory the precise timing of the shift changes, the exact duration of the caregiver's smoke breaks, and the predictable rhythm of Mrs. Peterson's rounds. He noted which floorboards creaked and which doors groaned, mapping the building's sounds as if they were a language. His observations focused on a critical window of opportunity he had noticed before, but never truly analyzed: the mid-afternoon coffee break. Every day at 3 o'clock, the two caregivers on duty would retreat to the small kitchen near the back of the dining hall, their conversation and laughter echoing faintly. During this time, the side gate leading to the dumpsters and the service road was left completely unsupervised. It was a brief, predictable lapse in the institution's otherwise rigid security. His plan began to form around this single point of vulnerability. On Wednesday afternoon, under the pretense of taking out the kitchen trash, he made a slow, deliberate trip to the dumpsters. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his movements were calm and measured. He scanned the perimeter fence, his eyes landing on the spot he remembered near the overgrown bushes. There it was, a section where the chain links had been pulled away from the metal post, creating a narrow, jagged opening, just large enough for a small, determined body to squeeze through. It was partially obscured by weeds, invisible to a casual glance, but a clear gateway to someone looking for one. He noted that from the gap, a steep, eroded dirt path led down the hill, disappearing into the dense woods that bordered the property. This was his exit. The knowledge felt like a key being placed in his hand, heavy with both promise and terror. He needed to confirm the timing. He spent the rest of Wednesday watching the clock, his entire being focused on the minute hand's slow crawl towards 3. When the hour struck, he watched as the two caregivers on duty set down their tasks and ambled toward the kitchen. He started counting silently, his lips barely moving. 1, 2, 3. He tracked the seconds as they stretched into minutes, listening for the sounds of their voices, the clink of mugs. He continued his sweeping, his back to them, every nerve ending tingling with anticipation. At precisely 20 minutes past the hour, he heard the kitchen door swing open and their footsteps returning to the main hall. The window was real. It was a 20-minute slice of freedom, a brief, shimmering crack in the fortress walls. It was not much, but for a boy running for his life, it was everything he could have hoped for. With the how and when now solidified, his mind turned to the what next. He knew the geography of the area from the few supervised walks they were allowed each year. The dirt road from the fence led down to the lake, a distance of about 1 mile. He pictured the terrain in his mind: steep, uneven, and littered with loose rocks and tangled roots. It would be a treacherous run, especially for someone weakened by chronic hunger. He had nothing to take with him: no food, no water, no jacket against the cool autumn air. His only supplies were the worn clothes on his back and the desperate burning fire in his chest. His only resource was his knowledge of the routine and the landscape. He would have to rely on speed and adrenaline to carry him to the water's edge, where he could hopefully disappear among the coves and inlets before any alarm was raised. Thursday arrived, a grey, overcast day that seemed to mirror the cold dread coiling in his stomach. This was the final day. He went through the motions of the morning meal, the watery oatmeal tasting even more like paste than usual. He could barely swallow. He risked a glance at Mrs. Peterson, who was observing the children from her usual spot by the door. Her face was an impassive mask, her eyes cold and distant. Did she know? Did she see the frantic energy hiding behind his placid expression? For a terrifying second he thought their eyes met, and he felt a jolt of pure panic, convinced his plan was written all over his face. But she looked away, her attention drifting to another child, and he realized he was still invisible to her. He was not Leo Miller, a boy. He was just an asset, a line item on a schedule, and that anonymity was now his greatest shield. As the afternoon approached, time itself seemed to warp, each minute stretching into an eternity. He was assigned to clean the hallways, a task that thankfully placed him near the dining hall and the side gate. Every sound was magnified. The distant hum of a boat on the lake, the scraping of a chair, the jingle of keys from a caregiver's belt. He felt a tremor in his hands and clasped them together, forcing them still. He was a bundle of raw, exposed nerves, his entire body thrumming with a single overwhelming impulse: run. He replayed the plan in his head one last time. Through the dining hall, out the side door, across the small yard to the fence, through the gap, and down the hill. Don't look back, don't stop, don't make a sound. It was a simple, brutal sequence of actions upon which his entire future depended. The clock on the wall struck 3. The sound of the chime was like a starting gun. He watched from the hallway as the two caregivers exchanged a few words, and then, just as he had observed, turned and walked toward the kitchen. He heard the door click shut behind them. The hallway was empty, the path was clear. This was the moment. His 20-minute window had just opened. For a final, fleeting second, he was paralyzed by the sheer enormity of what he was about to do, the terror of the unknown warring with the certainty of the fate that awaited him if he stayed. Then, the image of his name on that list, next to the words, "Delivery at the dock," flashed in his mind, and the fear was burned away by a surge of pure primal will to survive. He took a single, silent breath and began to move. His first movement was a whisper of motion, a ghost detaching itself from the shadows of the hallway. He moved on the balls of his feet, each step a deliberate, practiced placement on the cold linoleum floor. He crossed the threshold into the cavernous dining hall, a space that now felt like an open field under the enemy's watch. The air was thick with the smell of bleach and old food, but for the first time, it was also charged with the electric hum of his own terror and hope. He did not dare to look toward the kitchen, where the low murmur of the caregivers' voices was a constant, threatening reminder of his 20-minute deadline. His entire world had shrunk to the side door at the far end of the room, a rectangle of dim light that promised a world beyond these walls. His only thought was a silent, desperate chant. Do not make a sound. Do not be seen. Do not exist until you are through that door. He reached the door, his hand hovering over the cool metal of the handle. He paused for a single agonizing second, listening. The voices from the kitchen continued their lazy cadence, uninterrupted. He pressed down on the lever with excruciating slowness, cringing at the faint click of the latch retracting. The sound was a cannon shot in the silence of his mind. He pulled the heavy door open just enough to slip his thin body through, the hinges groaning in a low metallic protest. He was outside. The cool, damp air hit his face, a stark contrast to the stale atmosphere of the home. He was in the small, gravel-covered yard, a space of 20 feet separating him from the perimeter fence. For a moment, he was completely exposed, a solitary figure under the vast grey sky, and the fear of a voice shouting his name was a physical weight on his shoulders. He scurried across the gravel, his worn shoes making a soft crunching sound that seemed impossibly loud. He reached the line of overgrown bushes near the fence, diving into their scratchy embrace. The sharp twigs and thorny branches tore at his thin shirt and scraped his skin, but the pain was a distant, secondary concern. He was hidden. From his crouched position he located the gap in the fence he had scouted, a jagged tear in the fabric of his prison. He crawled toward it, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Squeezing through the opening was a slow, painful process. The rusted ends of the chain links snagged his clothes, holding him for a heart-stopping moment. He pulled, feeling the fabric rip, and then he was free, tumbling onto the soft, damp earth on the other side. He had made it past the first barrier. He was truly outside. The ground fell away steeply before him, a treacherous path of mud and loose rock that plunged into the dense woods below. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself down the incline, his legs pumping, his arms flailing for balance. The world became a blur of green and brown, the trees closing in around him, swallowing the last vestiges of the institution. The air here was different, alive with the smell of damp soil, decaying leaves and pine. The sounds changed too. The oppressive silence of the home was replaced by the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth and the whisper of the wind through the high branches. This new environment was wild and uncertain, filled with its own dangers, but it was a fear born of freedom, not of captivity, and it fueled his desperate flight down the hillside. His descent was reckless, driven more by panic than by control. His foot caught on a thick, gnarled root hidden beneath a layer of leaves, and his momentum carried him forward. He fell hard, his body slamming against the unforgiving ground. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his right knee. For a terrible moment he lay there, gasping for breath, the world spinning in a dizzying circle. The thought of failure, of being caught now, was a fresh wave of terror that was more potent than the pain. He pushed himself up, his hands sinking into the cold mud, his knee screaming in protest. He ignored it. He forced himself to his feet, stumbling, a low sob of frustration and fear escaping his lips. He could not stop. He had to keep moving. The rest of the run was a painful, adrenaline-fueled ordeal. He limped heavily, his injured knee turning each step into a fresh agony, but he never slowed. He could feel the clock ticking in his mind, the 20-minute window surely closing behind him. He imagined the caregivers finishing their coffee, the discovery of the open side door, the alarm being raised. The image of Mrs. Peterson's cold, furious face was a more powerful motivator than any physical pain. He pushed through thickets of thorns that tore at his skin, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He glanced over his shoulder once, half expecting to see figures moving through the trees behind him, but there was nothing. There was only the forest, and the crushing, overwhelming sense of being hunted. Finally, through a break in the trees, he saw it, a shimmer of grey, flat light, the lake. The sight sent a surge of renewed strength through his exhausted body. He pushed through the last line of trees and stumbled out onto a narrow, rocky shoreline. The vast, placid surface of Beaver Lake stretched out before him, its waters dark and cold under the overcast sky. The relief was so profound it almost buckled his legs again. He had reached the water. He had made it away from the home. But he was still exposed, a small, solitary figure on the empty shore. He frantically scanned the coastline, his eyes darting back and forth, searching for a place to hide, for some way to put more distance between himself and his pursuers. He knew they would search the woods first, but eventually their eyes would turn to the lake. And then he saw it, tucked away in a small, reed-choked inlet 100 yards down the shore. It was a small aluminum john boat, its dull metal hull almost camouflaged against the grey rocks. It was tied to a half-submerged tree stump with a thick, weathered rope. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in his chest. It seemed like an impossible miracle, a gift left just for him. He scrambled over the slick rocks toward it, his injured knee throbbing with every jarring step. He didn't question where it came from or who it belonged to. In his world, there was no time for questions, only for opportunities. This boat was his only chance, the single fragile vessel that could carry him away from his past and toward a future he couldn't yet imagine. It was his only way out. When he reached the boat, a new panic set in. The rope was secured with a thick, complicated knot, swollen and tight from the dampness. His fingers, cold and clumsy, fumbled with the coarse fibers. He pulled and twisted, but the knot wouldn't budge. He could feel precious seconds slipping away, his vulnerability on the open shore pressing in on him. A raw, guttural sound of frustration tore from his throat. He abandoned trying to untie it and began to claw at the rope itself. his fingernails digging into the frayed strands, scraping his skin raw against the rough bark of the stump. He pulled with all his remaining strength, his entire body shaking with the effort. With a sudden splintering crack, a piece of the rotten stump broke away, and the rope came free in his hands. He didn't waste a moment. He shoved the surprisingly light boat into the water, the splash echoing loudly in the stillness of the cove. He waded into the icy shallows, the cold shock of the water stealing his breath, and scrambled clumsily over the side. The boat rocked violently, threatening to capsize, and he threw his weight to the center, pressing himself flat against the cold metal floor until it stabilized. He was soaked, shivering, and his knee was a beacon of throbbing pain, but he was in the boat. He was on the water. A quick, frantic search confirmed his fear. There were no paddles. The hope that had surged just moments before flickered, threatening to die. But he had not come this far to give up. Lying on his stomach, he reached over the side, plunging his arms into the frigid water up to his elbows. He began to paddle with his hands, cupping them and pulling with a desperate, awkward rhythm. The boat moved with agonizing slowness, inching away from the shore. His muscles screamed in protest, his shoulders and back already aching from the unnatural strain. But it was moving. With each stroke, the shoreline receded, the trees and rocks of his escape route shrinking behind him. He was a tiny, fragile speck on the immense, indifferent surface of the lake, paddling with his bare hands into the vast, grey unknown. He had no destination and no plan, only the singular, burning instinct to put as much water as possible between himself and the life that had been scheduled to end in 72 hours. For 2 full hours, Leo paddled with his bare hands, a desperate rhythmic splashing that was the only sound in the vast stillness of Beaver Lake. His arms burned with an agony that spread to his shoulders and back, and the icy water had leached all the warmth from his body, leaving him shivering uncontrollably. The initial surge of adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by a deep, gnawing exhaustion, and the chilling realization that he was adrift with no destination and no hope. The grey sky pressed down, and the dark water stretched to every horizon. Just as a profound despair began to settle in his heart, a feeling that he had only traded one prison for another, he rounded a small, heavily wooded peninsula. And there, floating in a hidden cove, as if it had been conjured from a dream, was a small wooden houseboat, an impossible sanctuary in the middle of nowhere. A new kind of energy, born of disbelief and a desperate flicker of hope, surged through him. He paddled harder, his raw hands slapping the water, propelling the small John boat toward the silent structure. As he drew closer, he could see the details more clearly. It was old, its wooden siding weathered to a soft grey by years of sun and rain, but it was intact. It had windows with small curtains, a tiny porch with a single wooden chair, and it floated serenely on large, stable yellow platforms. It didn't look abandoned in the way he expected, with rot and decay. It looked asleep, a place waiting patiently. A rope ladder dangled from the side of its small deck, an invitation. He felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. Was someone inside? Was this some kind of trap? But the alternative was to remain on the open water, a helpless target. So he pushed the fear down and continued his approach. Reaching the side of the houseboat felt like arriving at the shore of a new world. He tied the John boat's rope to the ladder's bottom, wrung with trembling fingers, his entire body shaking from cold and exertion. The climb was a new ordeal. His muscles screamed in protest, and his injured knee sent jolts of fire up his leg with every upward pull. His wet clothes were heavy, and his grip felt weak, but the image of the hard deck just a few feet above him was a powerful lure. With a final guttural cry of effort, he pulled his exhausted body over the railing and collapsed onto the wooden planks. For a long moment he just lay there, gasping for air, the solid, unmoving surface beneath him a profound comfort. He was out of the water. He was hidden. He was, for the first time in his life, safe from immediate pursuit. This is how Leo Miller, at 11 years old, finally arrived at the moment that began our story. He pushed himself to his feet and cautiously approached the door to the cabin. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. He was expecting the smell of mold and the sight of decay, but instead, he was met with a scene frozen in time, preserved under a thin, uniform veil of dust. On a small table sat a neat stack of children's books, their spines uncracked. On a shelf against the far wall, a dozen toy cars were arranged in a perfect straight line. Colorful kites, shaped like dragons and birds, hung from the ceiling, their tails trailing motionless in the still air. This was not an abandoned place. It was a shrine to a childhood that had been carefully, lovingly put to rest. It was then that his gaze fell upon the wall next to the shelf, and the sight is what finally broke him. Hanging there in a simple wooden frame was a photograph of a family. A man with a kind smile and a woman with warm, laughing eyes stood on the deck of what looked like this very boat. Between them, with his arms thrown around both their shoulders, was a boy who looked to be exactly his age, 11 years old, with a gap-toothed grin of pure, unadulterated happiness. The image of that perfect, loving family, a mirror of the life that had been stolen from him, crashed into the wall he had built around his heart. The strength that had powered his escape, the resolve that had carried him across the water, it all dissolved in an instant. His legs gave out from under him, and he collapsed onto the floor, consumed by a wave of convulsive, heartbroken sobs that echoed in the silent, floating home. He cried until there were no tears left, until his body was just a hollow, aching shell lying on the cold wooden floor. The violent storm of grief slowly subsided, leaving behind a profound and unnerving quiet. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the hull of the houseboat, a soft, rhythmic rocking that was almost soothing. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against a wall, and looked around the room again, this time through eyes washed clean by his sorrow. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep and overwhelming sense of curiosity. This place felt different now. It didn't feel sad or lonely. It felt protective, like a warm embrace. Who were these people? Why had they left this perfect sanctuary floating in a forgotten cove? He felt, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was meant to find this place. Slowly, painfully, he got to his feet. He moved through the small space with a newfound reverence, his fingers gently tracing the layer of dust on the table. He picked up one of the toy cars, a small red convertible, its wheels still turning smoothly. He ran his hand along the spines of the books, reading the titles of adventures and mysteries. Every object in the room seemed to hum with a story, with the energy of a life filled with joy and love. It was a language he had almost forgotten how to speak, but one his heart recognized instantly. This was more than a refuge from Mrs. Peterson. It was a refuge from the entire world that had told him he was worthless. Here, in this floating time capsule, a child had been cherished. The air itself felt different, thick with the lingering presence of a happiness he thought could never exist. His exploration led him to a small, stone-faced fireplace built into one wall. On the simple wooden mantel above it, one object stood apart from the rest. It was a small, polished mahogany box, its dark wood gleaming even through the thin layer of dust. Unlike the toys and books, which felt like remnants of daily life, this box had an air of importance, of ceremony. It was placed perfectly in the center of the mantel, drawing the eye, demanding attention. It seemed to be the heart of the room, the focal point around which all these memories had been arranged. A powerful intuition seized him, a feeling that whatever secret this houseboat held, the answer was inside that box. His breath caught in his throat, and he felt a tremor of anticipation, a feeling that was equal parts hope and fear. He stood before the fireplace for a long time, just looking at the box. His hand, still raw and scraped from his escape, trembled as he reached out. This felt like a far more significant threshold than squeezing through the fence or climbing onto the boat. Those actions had been about running away from something terrible. This felt different. This felt like he was about to run towards something, though he had no idea what it was. He knew with an instinct that transcended logic that lifting the lid of this box would change the course of his life as profoundly as reading the messages on that caregiver's phone. His fingers finally made contact with the cool, smooth wood. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the silence of the houseboat pressing in on him, and prepared to uncover the truth that was waiting for him on the water. His fingers, still numb from the cold, made contact with the polished surface of the mahogany box. It was cool and smooth, a stark contrast to the raw, splintered wood of the John boat and the rough bark of the trees he had scrambled past. A profound stillness had settled over the houseboat, the only sound the gentle rocking of the water against the hull. This felt like a sacred moment, a final threshold he had to cross. The fear that had driven him for 3 days had been replaced by a quiet, trembling anticipation. He was no longer just a boy running from a monstrous truth. He was standing on the edge of a different kind of discovery, one that felt far more significant than the evil he had left behind. He knew with an instinct that hummed deep in his soul that lifting the lid of this box would not just reveal a secret, but would also define the person he was about to become. The weight of that potential future was in his hands. With a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted the lid. There was no lock, only a small, fitted clasp that released with a soft click. The air that rose from within was dry and smelled faintly of old paper, cedar, and something else he couldn't quite place. The scent of time itself, preserved and undisturbed. Nestled inside on a bed of faded blue velvet was a single folded stack of papers, yellowed with age and tied with a simple piece of twine. It was a letter. His heart, which had been a frantic drum for days, now beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. This was it. This was the voice of the houseboat, the story of the smiling family in the photograph. He carefully lifted the papers from the box, the twine crumbling to dust between his fingers. The paper was brittle, and he handled it with a reverence he didn't know he possessed, as if he were holding the fragile wings of a butterfly. He unfolded the letter under the dim light filtering through the dusty window. The handwriting was a beautiful, flowing cursive, written in dark blue ink. At the top of the first page, a date was written with careful precision, 1985. More than 2 decades before he was even born. He began to read, his eyes moving across the elegant script. The letter was addressed to a boy named Andrew, from his parents, Charles and Lucy Vance. It was a letter for his 11th birthday, the same age Leo was now. The words were filled with a warmth and affection that felt almost alien to him, a language from a world he had only known in the faded memories of his own childhood. He was reading a private moment, a message of love sent across time, and he felt a strange and powerful connection to this boy Andrew, who had once stood in this very room, cherished and adored. The letter spoke of the houseboat not as a simple gift, but as a promise. Charles and Lucy explained that they had spent 2 years building it by hand, piece by piece, as a secret sanctuary for their son. They called it the Drifter, a place where his imagination could set sail, a fortress built not of stone and steel but of wood, water, and unconditional love. They wrote about wanting him to have a place that was entirely his own, a world away from the pressures and expectations of the shore, a safe harbor where he could be free to dream without limits. As Leo read these words, the purpose of this impossible place began to crystallize in his mind. It wasn't just a home that had been left behind, it was a world that had been intentionally created to protect a child from harm. The concept was so pure, so antithetical to his life at St. Teresa's, that it almost felt like fiction. He continued reading, his throat tightening with an emotion he couldn't name. The parents described their hopes for Andrew's future, their pride in the kind and curious boy he was becoming. They wrote about the importance of kindness, of building things that last, and of leaving the world a little better than you found it. Then, near the end of the letter, he read the sentence that finally shattered the last of his defenses. They had written, "This boat is our love for you made solid. No matter where you go in life, no matter how stormy the waters become, know that this love is your anchor. It will always be here for you. With all our infinite love, Mum and Dad." The phrase infinite love struck him with the force of a physical blow. Mrs. Peterson had put a price on his life, $2,000. These parents had built an entire world for their son, a gift of immeasurable, infinite value. The tears that came this time were not the ragged, desperate sobs of grief and terror he had shed earlier. These were quiet, hot tears of profound understanding. He was crying for the love he had lost, but also for the love he had just found, preserved in this letter like a message in a bottle. He understood that the houseboat was not an accident or a coincidence. It was a monument. It was tangible. Physical proof that the kind of love his own parents had given him was real, that it existed in the world, and that it was powerful enough to outlast time itself. The cold, transactional cruelty of Mrs. Peterson and the home had tried to convince him that he was worthless, an object to be sold. But this letter, written by strangers decades ago, was screaming a different truth. It was telling him that a child's life was a thing of infinite worth. He held the letter to his chest, the brittle paper a warm weight against his thin shirt. The memory of his own parents, which had become a painful, flickering ember he was terrified of losing, now blazed back to life. He remembered his father teaching him how to skip stones across a creek, his mother's hands showing him how to tie his shoes. These were not just ghosts of a life that was gone, they were part of the same infinite love that had built this boat. He was not an orphan in the way St. Teresa's had defined him, an unattached, unwanted piece of inventory. He was the son of parents who had loved him, and that was a truth that could not be bought or sold. In the silent, floating house surrounded by the loving legacy of the Vance family, Leo Miller remembered who he was. After a long time, he carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the mahogany box, closing the lid gently. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet strength that came not from adrenaline, but from a newfound sense of purpose. He was no longer just hiding. He was protecting this place, this legacy. His eyes scanned the room again, seeing it now not as a collection of old objects, but as a map of a family's heart. His gaze fell back to the letter's final lines, which he had almost missed in his emotional haze. It spoke of one last secret, a treasure for the future, hidden where the heart of the home beats warmest. His eyes immediately went to the stone fireplace. It was the only source of warmth in the cabin, the symbolic heart of the small home. He moved toward the hearth, his movements no longer clumsy with exhaustion, but steady with intent. He ran his hands over the cool, smooth stones, and then down to the wooden floorboards in front of it. He tapped gently, listening to the sound. Most were solid, but near the left side, one board gave a slightly hollow knock. His heart began to beat faster again, this time with a sense of discovery, not fear. Using his fingernails, he managed to pry at the edge of the board. It was loose. With a soft groan of old wood, it lifted away, revealing a small, dark cavity beneath the floor. A secret compartment. It was real. Everything the letter said was real. He reached into the small space, his fingers closing around a package wrapped in thick, waterproof oilskin. It felt heavy, solid, and impossibly important. He unwrapped the package with a sense of reverence. Inside were a series of official-looking documents, thick papers filled with legal language he couldn't fully understand. There were property deeds, a last will and testament, and bank statements. They were the bones of the houseboat, the legal framework that had protected it all these years. He understood that Charles and Lucy Vance hadn't just built a refuge of love. They had fortified it with the rules of the world outside, ensuring its survival long after they were gone. They had planned for everything. They had planned for a future they would never see, a future where their love might be needed by someone they would never meet. The sheer depth of their foresight, their meticulous protective planning, was staggering. It was the most powerful act of hope he had ever witnessed. Tucked within the stack of documents was a small, crisp business card. The embossed letters read, Dr. August Henry Taylor, attorney at law, with an address in Fayetteville. It was a simple piece of cardstock, but to Leo it felt like a key to the entire world. He turned it over. On the back, written in the same elegant cursive handwriting as the letter, was a short, powerful message. It said, "He is the legal guardian of this refuge and of any child who finds it." The words seemed to lift off the card and settle directly into his soul. Guardian, refuge, child. These were not just words. They were a promise, a lifeline thrown across 30 years of time directly to him. He was not just a trespasser who had stumbled upon an empty house. He was the child who had found it. He was the one this promise was for. Holding the card in his hand, Leo looked around the small, dusty cabin one last time. He saw the toy cars, the books, the kites, and the smiling photograph on the wall. He was no longer a lost boy adrift on a cold lake. He was standing in a place that had been waiting for him. The Vances had built this sanctuary for their son, but in doing so, they had created something more. They had built an act of faith, a belief that love, when made tangible, could ripple outward and touch lives they could never imagine. Leo understood with absolute soul-shaking clarity that he was not alone. He had never truly been alone. He had been protected by the memory of his parents and guided to this place by the enduring love of strangers. The future was still a vast, terrifying unknown, but for the first time in 4 years it was no longer empty. It was filled with the light of a promise. 4 days later, a pair of local fishermen, surprised to see a small John boat tied to the long-dormant Vance houseboat, discovered a thin, exhausted boy huddled inside. Leo was taken to the county sheriff's office, a small, quiet building that felt both intimidating and strangely safe. He clutched the business card for Dr. August Henry Taylor in his hand, refusing to speak to anyone but the man whose name was on it. When the old, kind-faced lawyer finally arrived, summoned from Fayetteville, Leo recounted his story with a clarity and precision that left the officers in stunned silence. He presented the documents from the secret compartment, the tangible proof of his ordeal and the legacy of the Vance family. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, as Dr. Taylor placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, Leo felt the crushing weight of his solitude begin to lift. He was no longer a fugitive running for his life. He was a witness under the protection of a promise made 30 years ago. Armed with Leo's detailed testimony and the powerful legal standing of the Vance Trust, Dr. Taylor bypassed local channels and went directly to the state attorney general and the FBI. The information Leo provided was the key that unlocked a sprawling, horrifying criminal enterprise. The investigation that followed was swift and massive, dismantling an international child trafficking ring that Mrs. Peterson had been operating for over a decade. She and 15 of her accomplices were arrested in a series of coordinated raids that spanned 9 states and reached into 3 other countries. The true victory, however, was not in the arrests, but in the rescues. 63 children were found and liberated from clandestine clinics, remote labor camps, and urban begging schemes. The empty beds at St. Teresa's were finally explained, and the ghosts of Leo's lost friends were given a voice, their tragic fates bringing down an empire of cruelty that had thrived in the shadows. Leo never returned to St. Teresa's home for children. He was placed under the legal guardianship of Dr. Taylor, and soon after was legally adopted by Andrew and Christina Taylor Smith, a warm and gentle couple from Tulsa, who were the cousins of the original Andrew Vance. They had been named in the Vance Trust as secondary caretakers of the legacy. For Leo, entering their home was like stepping into the photograph on the houseboat wall. It was a world of quiet conversations, shared meals, and the simple, profound comfort of knowing he was wanted. The scars of his past did not vanish overnight. Nightmares still haunted his sleep, and trust was a fragile bridge he had to rebuild one day at a time. But he was no longer invisible. He was a son, surrounded by a patient, unconditional love that was the living embodiment of the promise left for him on the water, an anchor in the storm of his memory. 6 years later, at the age of 17, Leo stood before a crowd of journalists and supporters, no longer a frightened boy, but a poised and articulate young man. With the full backing of the Vance Trust and the support of his new family, he had helped establish the Andrew Waters Foundation for Child Rescue and Protection. The foundation, a testament to the enduring power of a single act of love, had already established 22 shelters across the country, rescued over 590 children from exploitation, and was training a new generation of advocates. Leo, serving as its international ambassador, now traveled the world, sharing his story not as a victim, but as living proof that one person's courage can illuminate the darkest corners of the world. The boy who ran to save his own life had become the young man who now dedicated his to saving thousands, multiplying the infinite love one family had left floating on the waters of Beaver Lake.